Hi everyone, my name is Alexandre Gouret. I am a coordinator of the OBVIA's Research Hub on Digital Sobriety alongside Florent Beg and under the supervision of Stéphane Roche and Christophe Abrassard, who are the directors of this Research Hub. You are joining us this morning for a talk entitled The AI Waste Problem, Thinking Informational and Ecological Pollution Together with Professor Anne Pasek. Today's session is the fourth and final in a series of conferences and discussions that took place in our seminar this fall. These conferences and discussions address the tricky question of how societies can use digital technology for socio-ecological transitions without falling into the pitfalls of the socio-environmental footprint of these technologies. And for now, I'm thrilled to hand it over to Professor Anne Pasek. Anne Pasek is an associate professor in the Department of Cultural Studies and the School of the Environment at Trent University. She is also the Canada Research Chair in Media, Culture, and Environment. Her research work lies at the intersection of climate communication, the environmental humanities, and science and technology studies. In particular, she studies how carbon becomes communicable in different communities and media forms to different political and material effects. She has notably written an article entitled AI Trash, published this year in the Journal of Environmental Media. It's a commentary discussing the rise of generative machine learning tools and their informational and environmental harms. It explores what Anne calls the AI trash problem, which is a very original way of framing the environmental challenges posed by AI and also the potential solutions to address them. We will have the pleasure of hearing more about it in a few moments. We'll have some time at the end for audience Q&A. So if you have any question at any point, please save them for that moment. We'll have plenty of time to talk. And without further ado, Anne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Alexandra. And hello, everyone. Thank you for spending your time listening to this talk. And I really hope that we'll get to have the chance for some good conversations thereafter. I'm just going to jump on in. So here's a roadmap of where we're going in the next hour or so. This talk is going to have two parts. Firstly, I'm going to lay out a case for why I think we should think about AI as a bit of a pollution problem, both in terms of its environmental impacts and also the effects that it's having on our public information commons. Then I'm going to explore some of the ways that we know what we know about this problem, as well as some of the ways that we can't know enough about it, seemingly, at least for now. Like, what are the gaps in our knowledge? What's sort of resistant to us determining like a robust empirical account? Because that sort of politics of the absence of knowledge here, I think, are a really key part of the issue. Then I'm going to borrow some analytic tools from the field of discard studies, seemingly quite adjacent from the question of so-called AI. But I think these tools are going to be really useful to sort of rethink what waste looks like on both these registers. And it's going to point us in some useful directions for how we could address the AI trash problem a little more systematically. So this is to say, I'm going to sort of ping pong across a couple of different forms of harm, a couple of different analogies, a couple of different fields of studies that you might initially assume have nothing to do with AI. But I hope they'll bring us to some really interesting points of synthesis. But I should begin with the caveat that I am not an AI researcher per se, right? I have no formal computer science education. I cannot train a large language model for you. It's going to be easier for me to like review a financial sheet or an executive speech than to review code. But I have kind of stumbled into studying people who study machine learning. This began out of an interest in sort of larger discussions about what it might mean to decarbonize academic research. And certainly in that discussion, right, there's just like a lot of really compute heavy research that has a climate impact in like deep learning and neural net fields. So I've got a journal article that's forthcoming in Science and Technology Studies, thinking about the ways that that community, that sort of set of computer science researchers, have been theorizing their own climate impacts and the carbon intensity of their field, and some debates about how to bring that down and how social organization might work in that knowledge community. It's a really interesting set of discussions. Like all discussions, right? Like there's no perfect silver bullet solution there. But I am really interested in sort of the social work of how we organize to address that problem. But like many of us in media studies today, you know, perhaps you feel this too. I feel kind of obligated to have like a hot take on AI in this moment of hype. So that took the form of this short commentary in Gem, where I lay out a bit of a polemic, and that's going to be the seeds of this larger talk today. And I'm also sort of informed here by some of the writing I've done with Mel Hogan in a forthcoming book, thinking about the role of the tech sector and its sort of shaping force in like questions around energy transition and what the sort of race to AI has done to sort of scramble quite a lot of those larger like grid decarbonization questions. So if you're interested in any of this, we can go deeper in the Q&A. But I wanted to start just by laying my cards on the table about why I think trash is like a useful word, at least for me, when it comes to approaching this problem. And there's maybe three components to this answer. The first is, quite candidly, I think derision and public mockery is just like politically helpful in a context where we have a sort of out of control tech hype cycle, right? So many of us are sort of feeling that we're in this moment where, you know, the emperor of the digital sector really has no clothes. If that's the case, like we should have pretty biting fashion commentary to offer. Trash maybe does some of that work. Secondly, as someone who comes out of the climate movement and spends a lot of time kind of fretting and worrying about the what often appears to be a disconnect between somewhat abstract conversations about carbon dioxide emissions and like energy consumption and modeling pathways and net zero, which is to say like numbers and figures on one hand, and then like the lived realities of people who maybe don't care so much about that abstract number, but care about cost of living questions, sort of like populist reactions to climate measures, like that. That's not a good political formula. I worry about that tendency repeating here in our conversations around AI. So my goal here is to sort of stubbornly find a way to sort of keep thinking across two registers at the same time. What is the global climate part of the story, and what are the sort of like local, place-based ways in which that problem is getting lived by people on the front lines of the issue? So I want to kind of zigzag across both of those things to think about what waste looks like in our modeling accounts, but also sort of tangibly in everyday life. And like trash is kind of useful there because we've got, you know, longer histories of environmental justice that we can draw on. And we can be curious about how this kind of shows up in people's everyday. Um, but finally, like the origin story of this whole thing, there was this stupid AI trash can that's been kind of haunting me. It's a product by a Canadian AI startup that promises to, quote, democratize waste wisdom. And you may say, like, what the hell does that mean? Well, in one version of this model, you wave your hand over the trash can, and it opens a little conveyor belt that you drop your garbage on. And a camera, using image recognition software, looks at your trash and decides, is it recyclable or is it garbage? And then the conveyor belt moves your trash into the appropriate bin. In another version of that, which you can see on the right, you just kind of hold your trash up to a camera, and then the screen will tell you, you know, it goes in this bin or that bin, so on and so forth. But like many things in our contemporary pivot to AI moment, like this is an obviously stupid product, right? Like the first thing is that there's like a carbon cost to like training all these models for image recognition and then running inference at a bunch of campuses in a ongoing basis every day to like tell us this is recyclable, this isn't. I don't have data specifically on Oscar, but I think by now we've all seen enough headlines to, recognize intuitively that like this environmental solution is going to also have an environmental cost. So instead of like the carbon-free work of just like thinking for a second, we've now got to run inference on, presumably hundreds of thousands of images a day if we're installing this in like a campus. Secondly, this product is simply set up to solve the wrong problem, right? Like people don't have a hard time like identifying whether or not the object they want to throw away is made of metal or paper. Instead, they have like a hard time caring about that assessment, right? And like adding more friction to that process in the form of all these automated systems, I don't think is going to change people's feelings or tolerance about all these things. And I'm honestly kind of sympathetic to people who are cynical about the value of recycling, because at least here in North America, a lot of those plastics are going to end up landfilled. And even if they aren't landfilled, even if they do make it to a recycler, like the net climate benefits of that is like not the least bit guaranteed. So like, really all this company is doing is like adding extra steps to a process that people are already kind of fed up with, whose legitimacy can be rightfully questioned. And like, again, like the process of training all that data, and installing cameras and conveyor belts everywhere, that all consumes resources. And if those resources don't meaningfully change the outcomes of a system, if they just kind of make us feel better about our role in one part of a larger unchained set of bad outcomes, like then those components themselves are a kind of waste. So I'm really stuck on this trash thing, right? Like the AI trash can is trash. And I think that dynamic just really is a kind of synecdoche of many, many aspects of our contemporary AI moment. So, another thing I want to think about here is how waste isn't just a question of climate emissions. It's also a question, I think, of polluting our informational environment. And the first symptom of information pollution is spam, right? So, on the commercial internet, where attention is monetized, there's a financial incentive to just like mass produce crap in the hope that you can catch some eyeballs with CEO trash or like, sorry, SEO trash. So this was a problem before generative text, but it certainly is just like making my life with internet search pretty horrible right now. Um, there's also a huge amount of AI slop out there, right? Slop, which we can maybe like distinguish from spam, for the ways in which it's sort of like low effort, and in some instances just like purposefully nonsensical. Because like our inability to resolve the meaning of these kinds of images like this, for example, is itself attention grabbing. We want that resolution. So there are kind of content farms out there that are sort of like pondering the best way to befuddle people with strange images for pennies per click. Um, and paradoxically, like by kind of flooding the zone with trash, this can drive people to go to like large language models, your chat GPTs all the more when seeking information. Traditional search is kind of rendered messy, and like there's the hope that maybe using chatbots to do attention gather or information gathering will be a bit more attention sparing, maybe a bit more trustworthy than the open web. Um, but in many cases, right, like that is actually not a good outcome. That can be for the worse, in part because these chatbots are just really confident liars. Sometimes these lies are innocuous, such as mangling the number of R's in the word strawberry, or more subtle and consequential, like stating that only a minority of signatories to the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. Um, so that's not great, We have a kind of bullshit machine, as scholars have argued here, that is really quite a problem to sort of bring into our practices of information gathering and search. Um, and of course, these tools sort of hypercharge larger scam efforts, some financial, some a little less materially consequential, but still like aggravating. Um, There's also, the ongoing questions of reinforcing stereotypes and social bias in their outputs. Many scholars have spilled quite a lot of ink on this front, and these problems are very much ongoing. All in all, right? Like I think we are at a moment where this is all for the worse, right? In how we find and share information. And I think that problem is especially expressed, and my worries are all the more acute when we think about like formal and informal information commons, whether that's peer-reviewed publications or like publicly managed data archives. So I'm a journal editor, and I will say that this job is getting less and less fun because there's just like a lot of slop, right, that floods our gates. Um, and we try really, really hard to ensure that only like honestly authored work goes out to peer review, but not everybody catches everything. So, like on the right hand, you can see an extremely weird AI generated diagram, supposedly of rat testicular stem cells. It makes no sense, and the language on here is nonsense. But it did make it past peer review and into publication, which is worrying. Um, and this is, a kind of exceptional and silly case, but there are, a kind of like baseline, much more ambiguous and erosive set of forces afoot. I think a lot about how Wikipedia editors have been trying to inoculate themselves against, like a flood of AI generated trash, trying to build AI detection tools into the culture of Wikipedia authorship, and to ask people to be like, hey, are you sure you want to mass generate a bunch of articles seemingly out of nowhere? Um, but it's really not clear that they're going to be able to get ahead of this sort of storm of people who, emboldened by AI, like feel like they can just show up and write encyclopedia articles. So that's really quite a problem because we do have this kind of trust-based system of guaranteeing some degree of reasonable accuracy for this stuff. And entering this new technological era does seem to throw those prior processes into question. I think there's also something similar happening in the law. We are seeing a rise of court filings that contain fictional case information, stuff that has been so-called hallucinated by LLMs. And there've been some splashy fines, some sharp words from some judges recently, but only in the case where that stuff's gotten caught. And I do worry a lot about, how much might be nevertheless getting through. And, I am not a lawyer, but my account of the law is one where, there is kind of this giant citational chain where the integrity of any one link of how we interpret case law is predicated on the integrity of all of the previous links. And so I do think there will be some long-term consequences to, just informational pollution in that system. And we're going to see how that profession handles that challenge. On the screen, you can see an excerpt from an email from Morgan and Morgan, which is an injury law firm in the States, one of the largest ones, trying to make it clear to lawyers in the firm that synthetic text will contain falsehoods and that you have to rigorously verify everything it generates. So the analogy here, I guess, is sort of, like failing to catch like a case reversal. And that's sort of the epistemic faux pas there. But we really are on the precipice of this becoming, less of an accidental mistake here and there, and more of just kind of like a plague upon the integrity of a legal citation. Another thing that really interests me is that AI trash is also a problem for AI researchers themselves. So our dominant model of building up so-called AI intelligence really is predicated on scale. So just throwing an increasing volume of trading data and compute at things in hope for better results. And this is why AI companies chasing that sort of frontier model pathway are more or less just kind of indiscriminately grabbing all the data they can, regardless of consent or copyright, because even getting like a linear advance in model performance requires an exponentially larger amount of input and compute. And the problem now is that there is no new data except for data that comes from the internet, and that data is now contaminated with AI trash. And AI trash is not good for young AI minds. If you keep training models on generative outputs, then you can get what's called model collapse. It's a problem that researchers are trying to think about and get in front of. You can kind of imagine it as like the machine learning equivalent of audio feedback. And as you can see, like the results here aren't that pretty. Um, there's actually been some speculation that one of the reasons why OpenAI's ChatGPT 5 was so underwhelming was that they may have, sort of poisoned the digital well with their product, such that the mass scraping of the internet is going to be much less useful than it used to be. So as a result, like there are scientists sort of thinking about a sort of boundary condition in the history of the internet, as if they were sort of paleontologists marking like a golden spike in the geologic record. Um, an artist friend of mine, Tiga Brain, recently released an extension called Slop Extruder that limits all your search results to pre-2023, which also kind of mirrors this like line in the sand. So there really is this kind of before and after to the rise of a world with generative AI slop, and we're kind of now living in a post-lapsarian world. So this all culminates into a big metaphor for me, right? Like maybe we're witnessing the equivalent of the introduction of a new pollutant into our cultural and information systems, which also happens to come with actual pollution to local air and global climate all at the same time. And the analogy that I've been thinking about is single-use plastic, and I'm definitely not the only person to make that connection, right? But there's a way where we can see the rise of like single-use text and newly disposable digital images. And I sort of wonder and worry that just like petrochemical CEOs in the 1950s didn't think terribly hard about like the long-term waste and public health crises that their products were gonna produce over the course of many lifetimes, lifetimes longer than those tech CEOs. I do think we have a parallel problem here with novel informational and climate pollution. So let's explore that problem. Normally, when I'm speaking to a new audience about climate and tech stuff, I have to do a lot of scaffolding work and sort of, maybe even explicitly come out and say, like, the digital isn't immaterial and the cloud is someone else's computer. But I think it's safe to say that that cat is out of the bag when it comes to so-called AI. There are many, many news stories and polemics all about the fact that this stuff comes with energy and carbon and material emissions. And generally, that story, as it circulates in public, is a story about quantity, right? Like, here are some numbers. They are large numbers. The line is going up. We have a kind of, alarming increase in that quantity. Maybe AI will boil the oceans. And on the one hand, I'm like happy that my topic is in the news. On the other hand, I'm like also a little bit worried about the character of this public discussion because I think there are some really important political and conceptual limitations to the framing that we often find here. There's times where this kind of reporting risks falling into kind of like reactionary tropes, or alternatively, suggesting that it's questions just about big numbers that don't really articulate in meaningful ways to people's everyday lives or sense of agency. Again, it's that kind of climate problem, right? Like big number bad, but how does that make me feel, or what do I do about it? We have this kind of account of AI that confronts us as something that is coherent, that is external, and that is maybe unstoppable. And that is not a winning recipe for political organizing. And when we do talk about what actions people could take, it's usually only in relation to their personal consumption. So there's often like, you'll find these sets of like vernacular tips about how to minimize the carbon impacts of one's AI use. I don't think that these tips are actually all that impactful on the grand scheme of things. Like we're talking about extremely, extremely mild mitigation measures here. So I think, the risk here is this ends up being more about palliating people's feelings of guilt, rather than being like a sincere effort to secure new social and material relations to these tech companies, to digital capital. There's the potential here for this to do far more harm than good. And even if we are on the consumer side shaving off some, small grams of carbon dioxide, even if on the industry side we are rendering things slightly more efficient, we still have this sort of new system bolted onto our existing world, creating a lot of pollution. And when we talk about the like informational pollution side of things, in these public discussions, there's often an acknowledgement that like this stuff can be frustrating, but maybe it's also funny, maybe it's also absurd. So maybe it's a phenomena that we can learn to tolerate, or we can at least feel better about ourselves for being smarter than the chatbots. And all of the weird shrimp Jesus images that you might find on the internet. You won't get fooled by that. Um, Alternatively, there's a lot of discussions about how we need to respond to this problem with education, right? Maybe it's really just a question of like training people to become better detectives, to be more skeptical and credulous. This also articulates into larger conversations around AI literacy. A lot of these initiatives are funded by tech companies themselves, which I think should raise our skepticism. Another tech company favorite would be to talk about how, we should have this goal of building more ethical AI, and that if we build enough sort of like retroactive patches onto models, models that are already publicly circulating, we could solve the bias problem. And have you considered we could also use AI to combat bias going forward, right? So AI is often imagined as like a double-edged sword. And the implication here is often like, let's not only focus on the edge of the sword that's pointed at us. Let's also consider its other capacities. And as you can tell, like the environmental framing of I am really dissatisfied with these sorts of directions and delimitations, right? This is often like a really reactive way of encountering the problem. It's often centered on individual consumers, without really giving an account of all of the players and forces in this system and their incentives. And it really just presumes at the end of the day that so-called AI is a given and that we have to personally adapt to and retroactively manage it. And I think that just gives way too much away from the start. So my aim here is really to develop a more systemic view of what's going on and how to intervene in it. And this means that we have to start with what we don't know. So how models are trained and weighted, how much compute with what kinds of energy, water, and carbon implications, and what regional grids and watersheds all really, really matter in assessing like the precise environmental impacts of these technologies. And overwhelmingly, we do not have that data. Estimates do exist, but such figures are partial and contingent. They really only give us a glimpse of AI's total energy usage, but never the whole picture. So the organizations that are best placed to produce like an energy or supply chain inventory of their products, right? Companies in the Magnificent Seven, like Meta, Microsoft, or the like, they simply aren't sharing the relevant information with the public. And their long existing habits of producing internal environmental reporting, those reports take great pains not to include AI specific figures. All these companies conveniently are headquartered in the USA, and under the Biden administration, there was a plan to like create a voluntary framework for these kinds of disclosures because that administration sort of thought that like reporting was going to be the first step towards some kind of state, but also industry self-regulation, like virtuous competition through metrics. But the Trump administration repealed that measure, like I think within the first 24 hours of his presidency, which probably means that this was something requested by big donors. So I think, pragmatically, we are not likely to get this information in a substantive and grounded way for the next 3 years. So that's a problem for people who might want to tackle this through like conventional environmental laws. Like the kind of lawfare that the environmental movement has practiced so often. Strong legal claims need to be based on strong evidence. But we are kind of stuck in this context where we don't have that evidence and we have to figure out how to act nevertheless in its absence. And there are rare cases, I'll say, where a company does offer some data, but that data is usually highly selective. So Google, for example, recently shared that like a single Gemini query, or more specifically, the median case of all of its Gemini user queries emits just 0.03 grams of carbon dioxide equivalents, which is about the same as watching like 9 seconds of TV. So that sounds pretty small. However, these figures do not tell us much of anything about the different use cases for Gemini, right? Like there could be some really weird long tail effects afoot here that this very carefully scoped metric ignores. And it doesn't tell us like what is the impact of Gemini as a whole, right? We have a new system being sort of bolted onto our lives. It is creating consumption where there did not used to be any. And so like I really think that it is like that overall system shape and impact that is the story worth telling. And it is one that Google is very careful not to. We can, however, have knowledge about the system without precision, right? We can learn the sort of general shape of direction of travel here. And there are researchers who are doing this work by taking open source models, training them themselves, and then like very meticulously counting the energy consumption that was involved in that work. So Satya Lucioni at Hugging Face has been a really big figure in this line of inquiry. This is just one of many papers she's been working on with a bunch of colleagues. Here exploring Bloom, which is a large language model used for producing generative text, like ChatGPT. And they found that like training Bloom itself generated 50 tons of CO2e over a 118-day trading run. That's not nothing. But even just keeping Bloom around after the fact, up and running and available for inference, that like baseline maintenance of the system emitted greenhouse gas equivalents on par with driving about 50 miles a day in an average gasoline powered car. Again, like every day, just like taking a car out for a drive just to keep this smaller system around and online. And so you can sort of extrapolate from this case study, being like, Bloom has this many parameters. How many parameters does like ChatGPT-3 have? That then gives us like an account, maybe ChatGPT-3. If we did only a single training run on it and didn't count the processes of cleaning and assembling that data, that would maybe look like 500 tons of carbon dioxide, again, just through training. And that is a much older version than what OpenAI is currently offering. And it's not unusual for companies to do, to train multiple different models and to continuously sort of retrain and recalibrate weights throughout the course of their life that, these figures are not going to cover. So we have ways of guessing. These guesses are big approximates, but they're also, we might be able to safely say, like relatively conservative ones. Because, if these estimates were dramatically off, if the story here wasn't one of sort of large and growing quantities of resources, right? Like these companies have a pretty obvious incentive to just come forward and correct them, and no one has. So another indicator we have of the direction of travel of the overall industry is looking at environmental disclosures from tech companies themselves. And since 2021, we've seen almost all of the big tech companies out there just like belly flop on all their existing sustainability pledges, precisely because of their AI investments. So Google had a goal of cutting its climate pollution in half by 2030 compared to a 2019 baseline, but its total emissions have actually grown by a little bit less than 50% since 2019. Microsoft is up by 30% from 2020. And as a company, it made this very large announcement, what it called its moonshot, that it was going to become carbon negative by the end of the decade. But this AI chapter really isn't helping that goal. And so its CEO is now estimating that like that moonshot, the moon, is somehow now like 5 times further away than it was at the opening of the decade. And this picture repeats across these companies, right? Emissions are aggressively increasing rather than falling as they'd hoped at the start of the decade. And just to belabor what might be an obvious point here, the reason why these corporations are failing all their climate pledges is that they are rapidly building out many more data centers to provide the computational infrastructure for AI tools. So Microsoft, for example, has this like entangled infrastructural and capital relationship with OpenAI. Together, they have announced plans for a $100 billion data center. Amazon, not to be outdone, has pledged 150 billion on new data center construction for the next decade and a half, specifically for AI clients. There are just more and more of these announcements every month. So that the sector is booming, and this means that things are really weird. You may have heard that AI data center capital expenditures were higher than the sum of all domestic consumer spending in the American economy this year, um, such that they are kind of effectively disguising symbols of a recession in the economy. That's very worrying. And the effect that this build out has had and will have on the electrical grid is a site of considerable anxiety for those in the know. So there's a range of forecasting out there, none of which 100% agrees what will happen. But we have a sense that maybe 9% or maybe up to 20% on the high end of all US electrical consumption at the end of the decade will be allotted to data centers. And the grid does not have the infrastructure or generation capacity to accommodate that. And this means that in communities where data centers are clustered, like in Virginia, for example, we're beginning to see really acute signs of strain. In the UK, for instance, right, like the equivalent there would be Ireland, where data center energy demand is like predicted to be up to a third of the country's energy capacity by 2030. This directly in the sort of life of everyday people means that consumers are going to see their energy bills go up. And this is because in most energy markets, the cost to improve and maintain grid infrastructure gets shared by all ratepayers. So if a data center sets up shop in your region and that data center needs new infrastructure built to service it, even if it's not like new generation, but like a transformer station or like a high voltage transmission line, everyone with an energy bill is going to pay for it, including those everyday consumers. And in some analyses, we've seen like price hikes in the tens of dollar ranges already in select markets like PMJ. And that just really obviously is going to exacerbate the cost of living crisis that I think pretty much everybody's still feeling. And it's just a clear economic justice problem. In the long term, right, like this sort of squeeze on demand and trying to sort of pull every gigawatt hour out of the grid that we can also checks out in the form of like grid stress. So we're looking at increased rates of brownout, maybe even possible blackouts in the medium to long term there. From the industry side, conversely, right, this demand problem that they can't get enough energy that they would like means that energy is a limiting factor to how fast the sector would like to build out. And to put that another way, like the tech sector wants to build many more data centers than it currently is. Its aggressive rate of growth, right, is limited by finite energy supply. And this means that a lot of clean energy pledges are being abandoned, and a lot of fossil assets are finding new buyers. So to name just two examples, in Kansas City, the life of a coal plant was extended by 5 years to power, in part, like a really massive meta data center. And in Virginia, again, where there's just like way too many data centers, their grid provider has made just like a ton of recent gas plant investments and is considering possibly delaying the retirement of more coal plants. So it's gotten to the point that like there's now a global shortage on buying gas turbines because everybody has bought all the ones that could have been produced to power up new data centers in this sort of like gold rush for gigawatts. And if we look closer at some of these communities, right, we do find a lot of local land use conflicts. And the picture that's emerging is that data centers are often really bad neighbors. So in these sort of data center hyperspaces like Ireland, Virginia, but also sometimes the Netherlands, Singapore, Chile, France, people are just increasingly unhappy with the bargain that local leaders strike when they bring a data center into the community. These can sometimes provide you some tax revenue, but they generally don't provide a lot of jobs. And people are increasingly aware and unhappy about the impact that they're having on energy prices and on grid stability. People in rural communities do not like the fact that they can take up farmland. In urban areas, people do not like that they are taking up space that might be given over to housing. People are really worried that these data centers will overdraw local water resources, particularly if they are tapping into aquifers. We can have sort of permanent loss of groundwater reserves, and that's horrible in drought constrained regions in particular. And like people who are living like right next to these places on the fence line really, really hate the noise, right? Living next to one of these things can be genuinely nightmarish because the fans that cool all the server racks inside produce like a low frequency noise 24/7 that can penetrate quite far out. And there are not yet kind of like adequate standards and noise abatement measures to kind of ensure that that won't happen with any given data center build. And just to belabor the point here, I want to bring up one specific case study, that of Colossus. It is a hyperscale data center that came online in Memphis, Tennessee in 2024, and it is possibly the world's largest AI data center. It costs in the ballpark of $1 billion to build, and when it comes fully online, like it'll have maybe 1 million GPUs in there churning away. And it currently needs more electricity than the local grid can supply it. So instead of waiting for that grid capacity to get built, the company brought in a fleet of like 30-something portable gas generators, each about the size of like a big rig truck. It's what you can see in the picture on the right. And those generators burn fossil gas 24/7 on site to power it. So you might imagine this is very bad for the climate, but it's also very bad for local public health, that air pollution is an issue. It's also the case that this company is using about 20 more generators than it got its initial permit for. And investigative journalists had to like discover this by like flying a drone and using thermal imaging, which is the picture on the left there. And like the scale of this all is kind of hard to hold in our heads. Like it's consuming the equivalent of like 3% of the entire state of Mississippi's energy grid. So this is really the equivalent of like moving a utility scale gas plant into the neighborhood. And that neighborhood is majority Black. And there is a long history of dealing with the effects of environmental racism there. Like asthma rates are already quite elevated because of prior air pollution problems. They are, of course, legally contesting all of this, but the company's position is that like these are temporary energy assets. So as long as they don't sit in the same exact place for more than a year, they should be exempt from federal clean air legislation. And in case you didn't already know, right? Like that company is Elon Musk's xAI. And all this pollution is for the benefit of training and inferencing Grok, which is X's in-suite so-called AI chatbot. And this brings us back to the informational layer of the AI trash problem. So this whole complex exists just so a company can offer a product that's like less woke than other companies' AI bots, certainly less risk adverse when it comes to copyright and defamation. And I really look at this all and I can't help but see it as like a further degradation of the information environment of the internet. And like not only just that one weird day where Grok kept talking constantly about white genocide. So this is admittedly like kind of an outrageous example. And I think it's fair to ask, like, would there be so much focus on the like environmental concerns in Memphis? Would the story circulate as widely, have been picked up as far, if it wasn't associated with a product that was so obviously sloppy and polarizing and stupid as xAI? But for me, I think the story of Grok is a clear signal that we really do have a lack of regulatory scrutiny, or frameworks to really prevent the kind of worst actors in this space. And if we aren't catching the worst actors, then we're really not doing anything at all for the merely average ones. So I think we've got a pollution problem here. And that's a problem worth thinking across a couple of different registers, because pollution is a really tricky thing, both materially but also sociologically, right? So previously I was using this metaphor of plastics pollution, right? We've got a kind of introduction of a novel technology. It produces a range of harms that were difficult to kind of manage. Maybe we didn't do our full share of trying to manage them. But we're sort of at a point here where, like plastic, maybe this technology is going to be integrated into society to the extent that it, seems impossible to get rid of it, let alone to remediate the harms that it's already done. Unfortunately, unlike conventional forms of pollution, the prospects of getting clear environmental data on like a large language model and then suing a bunch of companies, like I've been mentioning, doesn't seem likely to me, at least in the short term. But I do think there are still many ways that we can sort of like conceptualize and apply pressure to the system, both from above and below. And I think this is maybe like the greatest potential dividend of thinking about the problem of AI through the field of discard studies, right? That there are both cultural and political analyses of waste systems that we've already developed and which can apply here to good effect. So, what is discard studies? It is a way of knowing trash, and I think it's got some good insights. So firstly, we've got a kind of analysis of how we can think about discarding practices themselves as ways in which to know how the wider system works, how it maintains its structures, basically how power functions in material and social arrangements through discarding. Secondly, discard studies encourages us to be suspicious about the categories we've inherited for knowing waste, because these categories are often unhelpful. And finally, it encourages us to scrutinize the way that waste problems have been framed in the first place, because we're going to get different vantage points into that wider system. We can open and close a lot of analytic doors, just by how we sort of conceptualize, like, what is the problem of waste? And to just give an example of those principles of action, I thought I'd walk you through a discard studies account of plastics, right? So we can understand how access to disposable packaging has been really integral to the rise of like new cultural and logistical forms, right? Like also new ways of concentrating capital and like standardizing and managing production processes across global supply chains, right? So like these plastic burger boxes are also a story of power. But it's also true for the discards of these systems, right? Most plastics get landfilled domestically, where they can cause a lot of problems for sort of downstream environmental toxins in local neighborhoods. Again, quite often impacted by redlining and histories of racial exclusion. When they do get exported, they often go by and large to Asia, where they impose environmental burdens, right? Like the toxic processes of recycling, or more likely also landfilling. They end up getting absorbed by distant populations and landscapes. So again, we have a kind of racially inflected, maybe colonial account of what environmental harms are and do. Secondly, we've got to complicate our categories. So there's many kinds of plastics, right? All of which have very different environmental and public health profiles. Some chemistries here, we do have like a decent technical way to reprocess them. Never to recycle them fully, but to downcycle them into other potentially useful forms. Other forms of plastic, we simply don't. Nevertheless, the industry keeps putting the same recycling symbol on all forms of plastic and encourages us to think that like plastic is a coherent category and all plastics can be recycled. Similarly, like I think that there's like a bunch of use cases for plastic where there are wildly different technical or moral factors in play, right? Like we probably want to keep using single-use plastics in medical settings, long after we've like pulled them out of like food systems, just to give one example. And the fact that like public discourse keeps happening through the generic category of plastics is itself a barrier to like nuance and effective action, right? Like think of how better this conversation would be if we were talking about polystyrenes versus polypropylenes, maybe. Thirdly, and importantly, right, we have to understand plastics and plastics recycling as really a story of regulatory capture rather than a kind of unalloyed environmental good. So, as you've been hearing me talk about, right, like the modern recycling system has a lot of limitations. And it was also in many ways shaped by the beverage industry as a way to avoid regulations that would make them like responsible for end of life costs for bottles and cans. Instead, they put a lot of effort into sort of reframing the issue as one of bad individual actors, right? The figure of the litter bug. This is a kind of like classic story of individualizing systemic problems, or at least trying to like really muddy the waters of who's responsible or like what the appropriate solution would be. Maybe it's not about the creation of these like novel chemicals. Maybe it's just about people who aren't responsible enough to put them in the right bin. And finally, another part of this problem is that like this emphasis on the consumer ends up ignoring all the non-consumer facing waste practices. So this means that we often lose sight of like the whole forest just by looking at this one particular tree that we have close at hand. So with some of the more famous plastics problems, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, it seems like that patch is mostly an effect of the fishing industry rather than anything anybody does or doesn't put into a recycling bin on the coast, right? Like it's the industry applications, not the consumer behaviors that are the big problem there. And so if you ask like very, very cool discard studies scholar Max Liboiron, like what's one thing that you can do to reduce plastics pollution? They will say you need to end fossil fuel subsidies, right? You kind of have to attack the supply chain of that system rather than exclusively regulating its outputs. And maybe only like the kind of popular or public outputs that live in the world of consumers and citizens. And this always struck me as something that like a lot of us are missing in a lot of different environmental analyses and something that I really want to carry forward in my work with digital systems. So that's the discard studies account of plastics. Let's run our analysis of so-called AI systems through this gauntlet. So how is the story of AI one of a story of how power works, right? And certainly the way that the sector has allied itself with the Trump administration is like a bit of an object lesson in regulatory capture, right? It's unlikely that that government will do much in the way of policy development or enforcement. And indeed, they seem to be interested in preventing state governments from making any of their own regulations. It's quite disturbing. But I also want to focus on the larger story of what's motivating the tech sector's current AI boosterism at all, right? Like, why are so many of these companies wasting so much money on products that aren't making a return on investment and whose outputs are often extremely trashy? And there are a lot of explanations out there, and I think we're going to have a plurality of them sort of hold true over the course of history. But one that I find just particularly compelling is to sort of put this all in the context of the end of zero interest rate investments. So, we had the pandemic that caused inflation that led to banks ending their very, very historically low interest rates. Those low interest rates were really important to the digital sector because it meant that if you were, a billionaire who had some money to throw around, a conventional financial instrument wasn't going to give you a very large return, but investing that into tech stocks for growth companies, or maybe into some venture capital unicorn plays, really did credibly promise like a far higher rate of return. Now that's maybe not so much the case. And a lot of these tech companies have already secured near monopoly market shares. And if they want to still be growth stocks, they need to kind of invent new areas of growth. It's also the case that, the relative power of labor in the sector has been decreasing through, in part, this sort of inflationary question, rising wage pressures, which means that companies are even keener to sort of pursue arguments around automation. and to sort of reduce the relative power of labor within capital markets. So here I am kind of standing with a growing number of scholars that are pretty convinced that this is the bargain that holds true not only within tech companies, but also outside their orbit, right? Like it's probably the case that there are a lot of CEOs who have just like an ill-placed FOMO about AI. There's probably also a lot of CTOs who just fundamentally misunderstand like what can AI actually do for their company. But I bet there's also quite a few, and maybe a majority of managers out there, executives, who know that AI can't do people's jobs, but that simply having like the threat of automating these jobs away, or the ability to like speed up and de-skill informational work, like that's going to solidify the power of management, even if there's a dip in quality in the process. And so like as Kate Crawford has argued, like this is something we entirely miss when we're only talking about this problem as one of sustainability or of ethics or efficiency, right? We need like a very different set of political analyses and tactics if we're going to understand the problem as one that's concerned with who has power in the workplace or in political systems more broadly. And I go back to Memphis, like these questions of power are imbricated in the legacies of racism and colonialism. And there's like a lot of really interesting work emerging on these questions as scholars map out these like historic and geographic patterns. And sure enough, history repeats itself through the practices of discarding digital systems and redlining. And if we look outside the US, there's also the issue of largely racialized and global South data workers who are involved in like cleaning training data sets and managing disturbing content questions after those models get kind of prematurely released. And there's also the question of like the legacies of colonialism and racial capitalism in our current world system very alive there. And again, this is something that an emphasis on bias alone or ethics in and of itself as like a kind of self-defined category generally will get missed. Secondly, just like plastic, I think there's a need in our scholarship to stop treating all algorithmic systems, all machine learning models, as artificial intelligence. You can see that I use so-called AI quite a lot in my talk because, like, I think those words themselves, like, ultimately mean very little and are as confusing as plastic is when it comes to trying to develop an environmental politics that can get, like, nuance and traction on important parts of the issue. So this means I'm not even going to go into the question today of whether or not AI can do good things too, because I think that question is just a direct effect of our semantic confusion in this space. Like, I don't want to ban medical plastics, even though I do want to ban, like some plastics in the grocery store. I also don't want to ban custom-built protein folding machine learning tools. Those are generally good. They're effectively scoped. They're not that big of a problem. But we shouldn't let the existence of like a narrow set of socially useful applications prevent us from like apprehending and constraining the overwhelming amount of trash that comes from large language models and just all kinds of Gen AI. So, there's like an environmental and social benefit to like building up these distinctions because these tools are not the same. And finally, I've sung some of these verses already, but I do want to encourage us to like de-emphasize consumer behavioral choices or environmental virtues and to think more often about like system level actors, right? Zuckerberg and Musk, like their decisions matter a lot more than my students do. And I really worry that an environmental politics around so-called AI might end up looking a lot like Keep America Beautiful and like the recycling ethics against litter bugs. Working hard to like try and generate a lot of emotions in the part of public interactions with systems, but at the expense of actually regulating those systems as a whole. So it's worth keeping in mind that like a lot of so-called AI use today is induced demand, that it is created by companies who are forcing the adoption of large language models into pre-existing products, and that none of this is being sold for what it costs. there's like a huge amount of non-user facing systems also that we are ignoring. If we only ever worry about how like we can prompt ChatGPT more effectively. So it's like the system we want to shape, right? How do we do that? And through what set of leverage points beyond just our own consumption and beyond just sort of existing conventional environmental law. One place I think to look is organized labor. So a huge source of optimism for me is the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strike. This was the Hollywood writers and animators. They went out on the picket line and they won restrictions against AI in their contract. It was a big improvement for their job security and work environment, which is great for them. Also, it's great for us because it sort of proves that it can be done. So my faculty union just wrapped up bargaining a couple months ago, and we've borrowed directly from SAG-AFTRA language in our new contract. It will prohibit us from being forced to use AI tools where we don't want to, or for any of our data being used to train models. And I would love to see more and more sectors like really, really go out and win this kind of language. It's an example of what Blair Attard Frost calls AI counter-governance. And I think it's a trajectory that we should just think more about, particularly as the possibilities for like legislation within the US like are going to remain elusive. A less organized, but I think still very interesting form of labor action comes in the form of algorithmic sabotage, right? So like kind of digital Ludditism in the proper historical sense, where there's just like a lively group of artists and researchers who are working on ways to punish AI scrapers that steal content to train models. And these are definitely like the weapons of the weak, and it's not clear to what extent this threat is meaningful to large numbers of LLM companies, because they definitely wouldn't tell us if it was a bugbear. But I think the hope here is that there's some degree of sanctuary or retribution that can be offered to digital workers in the creative economy. And also, this points to, wider regulatory landscapes. I'm really, really interested in what is going on in the EU right now. I think this is the closest answer we have to finding a parallel for Max Liboiron's prompt that if you want to cut plastics pollution, you should end fossil fuel subsidies. I think the equivalent of fossil fuel subsidies, the larger like cheap supply chains of AI, is are really atrocious privacy laws. And thus, it's time to kind of fundamentally revisit the social contract of the ad economy. So, in the EU, there was GDPR, a very good step in that direction. The Digital Services Act is another. There are policies here that ensure some measure of meaningful consent about the collection and sale of personal data, and speculation that like there's ways to shape these laws to make it illegal to use models trained on illegally procured data, which would quite directly impact the kind of supply chain of these frontier models. It's not perfect, but it is miles ahead of the North American regulatory landscape. And like it's clearly aggravating to tech billionaires and JD Vance, which is a sign that it's probably onto something. But I also want to flag that like it's very much under attack. So last month there were some European Commission documents that got leaked, suggesting that they were going to revise GDPR to lessen these very same restrictions I'm pointing to as a site of hope here. So we shouldn't take any of this for granted, and we've got to sort of rally in the defense of standards that we have, even as we're pushing for them to be expanded. So the battle here is very much ongoing, and the future is unwritten. And in terms of how that's landing here in Canada, like we should also be really curious about the role of the state in shaping like the directions of travel of our own domestic industry. So the Kearney government very clearly has high hopes for AI to deliver bureaucratic cuts and efficiencies and to develop some manner of homegrown industrial economic golden egg. I am doubtful about the prospects of such things, which is in part why I got a bunch of scholars together over the summer to write a white paper thinking about what a kind of harm reduction focused approach to domestic policy might look like. And we've also got a white paper, a little editorial out in Policy Options, basically saying that like, hey, there's ways in which like tax incentives, strategic investment, procurements, consultation structures, sort of like, future-proofing grid modernization and decarbonization plans, and maybe even like a crown company for compute could be things that we do to shape participation in a sector that minimizes the degree to which we're exposed to like big, scary bubble pops and the kind of economic ravages that those bring, and also building out infrastructure in a way that reduces environmental impact and like local opposition. You don't have to be extremely dumb in how you do this. Here are some ways to, sort of stack the deck of cards towards less bad outcomes. So not the most like rallying political cry here, but I am kind of interested in again like thinking about what are different tools, what are sort of non-reformist reforms that could be helpful in pushing those arguments forward. And you're going to find different arguments, different forms of traction based on which governments you're talking to. And here's my attempt to talk to Mark Carney. But with that, I'm going to wrap up here. Stop talking and hopefully listen to a lot of your perspectives and questions, because I know that you're a very, very interesting and smart group of people. I'm curious what you think about this kind of discard studies read on AI and what other sort of like levers you might want to pull to take out the trash, as it were. So thank you so much.
And thank you. Thank you so much for this really, really fascinating talk.